At our 45th wedding anniversary gala beneath crystal chandeliers and in front of more than 200 guests, my husband raised a champagne glass and smiled. Then he pointed at me and said, "I stayed out of obligation, not love." His mistress slipped her hand into his and added, "Tonight she signs everything away." Laughter echoed across the ballroom as a folder was placed in front of me. I lowered my eyes, picked up the pen, and said nothing. They thought they had won that night. They never imagined that years later the same man would kneel before me and beg for the one thing he could never buy back. This story begins quietly, but it won't leave you unchanged. Before we dive in, drop a comment. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after someone you trusted broke it? Yes or no? I read everyone. And your words might help someone else today. Quick note. Some details are adjusted for storytelling, but the message is what matters most. At 67, I stood outside the Regency ballroom doors, wearing the same black silk dress I wore the night my life ended 7 years ago. My name is Lorraine Townsend. I'm a widow, though not in the way most people mean. My husband of 45 years is still alive somewhere in Springfield, Missouri, probably sleeping beside the woman who helped him destroy me. But the woman I was when I married him. The woman who sacrificed a promising finance career and sold her parents' $4.2 million estate to save his failing company. That woman died on September 10, 2016. She died in this building, in this hallway, wearing this exact dress. Tonight was September 13, 2023. 7 years, 3 days, and approximately 4 hours since I signed the papers that erased my name from everything I'd built. Through the tall glass doors, I could see crystal chandeliers refracting light across white linen tablecloths. A string quartet played something classical and forgettable near the stage. The scent of white lilies drifted through the gap beneath the doors, that particular hothouse sweetness that wealthy people associate with elegance. Everything looked exactly as it had 7 years ago. Same ballroom, same flowers, same predatory crowd of Springfield's finest, dressed in their silk and wool armor, ready to witness whatever spectacle the evening provided. The only thing different was my hands. 7 years ago, when I stood in this corridor, my hands shook so violently I could barely hold a pen. Tonight they were perfectly steady. That steadiness had taken 2,556 days to earn. Every single one of them silent. Every single one of them spent building toward this moment. I smoothed the black silk over my hips. The fabric still fit, though my body had changed in small ways time demands. The dress wasn't expensive. I'd bought it off a sale rack at Dillard's in 2015 because I needed something appropriate for company dinners, but didn't want to spend money on myself. That's who I was, then a woman who built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire brick by brick, and still bought her formal wear on clearance. The last time I wore this dress, I signed a piece of paper that erased 45 years of my life. Tonight I was wearing it again because I wanted them to remember. Every single person in that ballroom who witnessed my humiliation, who whispered about poor Lorraine Greer behind their champagne flutes, who watched me walk out of here broken. I wanted them to see this dress and remember exactly what they'd done, what they'd allowed to happen. I wanted them to see me walk back in. 7 years ago, I left this building and disappeared into the Missouri night, and not one of those 200 guests ever called to ask if I was all right. Not one. Some people asked me later why I kept the dress, why I didn't burn it or donate it or throw it in the back of a closet where I'd never have to see it again. The answer is simple. I kept it because I knew even in that first terrible week when I could barely function that I would need it again. I kept it because I understood that revenge is not a sudden hot flame. It's a long, cold burn that requires patience and preparation. And symbols matter. This dress was my battle flag. I checked my watch, 7:03 p.m. Inside the cocktail hour would be reaching its crescendo. Lester Greer, the man I'd once called my husband, would be holding court near the bar, surrounded by the same sycophants who'd applauded when he destroyed me. Holly Bentley, 50 years old and still playing the role of the younger woman, would be draped on his arm wearing something tight and expensive that I'd indirectly paid for. They thought tonight was their triumph. Another gala, Another performance of power, another opportunity for Lester to stand at a microphone and rewrite history while Springfield's elite nodded along. They had no idea what was actually about to happen. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand tonight, you need to understand that night. The anniversary night. The night I still wore hope like a delicate necklace, unaware it was about to be ripped from my throat. September 10th, 2016. Same Regency ballroom, same black silk dress, same white lilies. But 7 years ago, I wasn't standing outside the doors with steady hands and cold resolve. I was standing inside in the corner near the string quartet, wearing a soft, gentle smile that I'd practiced in the mirror that morning. The banner behind the stage read, "Lester and Lorraine, 45 years in white and gold script. 45 years of marriage." More than 200 guests from Springfield's business and political elite filled the room, the mayor, 3 circuit judges, every major commercial real estate developer, within 50 miles the board members of Midwest Freight Solutions, their spouses, their business partners, everyone who mattered in our world. I stood in that corner and genuinely believed my husband would thank me. After 30 years of sacrifice abandoning my finance career at 24, when he said he needed me selling my parents' entire estate when his company nearly failed in 1998, working 60-hour weeks to build Midwest Freight Solutions from a failing trucking operation into one of Missouri's largest logistics companies, I truly believed that Lester would stand before 200 people and say thank you. I had even practiced my smile for that moment. Not the polite smile I wore at business dinners, but the genuine one. The one that said we did this together and it was worth it. Looking back now, I can see how foolish I was. But at the time, hope is a powerful anesthetic against doubt. Hope convinced me that 45 years of loyalty meant something, that sacrifice would be acknowledged, that the man I'd built an empire beside would finally see me as more than scenery in his story. I stood there in that corner of the Regency ballroom and thought, tonight, he will say something that makes me believe my 45 years meant something. I was right. He did say something. It just wasn't what I thought. Lester took the stage hand in hand with Holly Bentley, and the diamond ring on her finger caught the spotlight before his words even began. Lester Greer, 69, stood center stage in his custom Italian suit, gripping the microphone like he owned the room because he thought he did. Holly Bentley, 50, stood beside him in a cream dress that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, the diamond ring glittering under the spotlight like a trophy she'd won. 200 guests turned toward the stage expecting the usual anniversary toast. What they got instead was a public execution. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Lester began. "I want to be honest with you. This isn't just an anniversary celebration. This is also a goodbye." The room went completely silent. For 45 years, I've fulfilled my obligations to Lorraine, but I stayed only out of duty, out of pity for a woman who became nothing more than a withered, obsolete shadow in my life. I stood frozen in my corner, the practiced smile still stupidly fixed on my face. "I never loved her," Lester said, and Holly squeezed his hand. "Not really. Not the way a man should love a wife. I stayed because I felt sorry for her, because I'm not the kind of man who abandons responsibilities even when those responsibilities have long since ceased to serve any purpose." Someone gasped. A champagne flute clinked against a table, but most people just stared at Lester, at Holly, at me. "Tonight I'm choosing happiness. I'm choosing Holly. We're getting married next month in Cabo San Lucas." Holly took the microphone, then her voice sharp and businesslike. "Lorraine," she said, and 200 pairs of eyes swung toward me. "The divorce papers are ready. You need to sign them tonight. You'll forfeit the house, the retirement accounts, and your shares in Midwest Freight Solutions. All of it. And you'll do it quietly without making a scene, or we'll be forced to use harsher measures. We know where your children live. We know about your grandchildren." I stood there among 200 people and looked at the diamond ring sparkling on Holly Bentley's hand under the ballroom lights. I knew exactly whose money bought that ring, the same money that saved the company in 1998, the same money from my parents' estate that I'd liquidated without hesitation when Lester said we'd lose everything. That ring was bought with my inheritance, with my sacrifice, with the future my parents had wanted me to have. and I still hadn't signed anything. The ballroom felt like it was underwater. Voices reached me distorted and slow. Someone stood up and quietly left through the side exit. Others followed, but most stayed frozen in their seats, certain they wanted to see how it ended. People asked me later why I didn't fight, why I didn't scream or throw something or tell everyone in that ballroom the truth about whose money built that company, whose 60-hour weeks turned a failing trucking operation into one of Missouri's most profitable logistics firms. The answer is simple. I had already seen what I needed to see. I saw the way Lester kept glancing at the exits. I saw Holly's hand trembling slightly despite her aggressive words. I saw the circuit court judges avoiding eye contact. I saw the mayor's empty chair. Most importantly, I saw what they were actually afraid of. At 11:30 p.m., the ballroom was empty except for cleaning staff quietly stacking chairs. I sat alone in the second-floor corridor outside the venue offices waiting. The carpet was burgundy. The air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and dying white lilies. Dwight Cummings, 43, set the legal folder on the corridor table with hands that shook so badly the papers rattled. He was Holly's brother, a corporate attorney who specialized in making inconvenient problems disappear behind layers of legal language. He wore a gray suit that needed pressing and avoided looking directly at me. "Mrs. Greer," he said quietly, "if you'll just sign each page where I've marked with the tabs." I looked straight into his eyes then, and I saw the only thing that mattered. He was terrified. Not nervous, not uncomfortable. Terrified, but not of Lester, not of Holly, of me, of what I knew, of what I could do with that knowledge if I chose to fight. That's when I understood. They hadn't brought me up here to finish me off. They'd brought me up here to contain me, to make me go away quietly before I started asking questions they couldn't answer. Questions about where the money actually went. Questions about whose signatures were on which corporate documents. Questions about offshore accounts and creative bookkeeping and shell companies that didn't exist 3 years ago. Dwight Cummings was terrified because he knew exactly what they'd done. And he knew I was smart enough to figure it out. I picked up the pen. I signed every single page, slowly, methodically reading each clause, even though my eyes could barely focus through exhaustion and shock. Dwight shifted his weight from foot to foot, glancing toward the elevator every 30 seconds, like he expected federal agents to emerge at any moment. When I signed the last page, I set down the pen, stood up, and walked toward the elevator without looking back. "Mrs. Greer." Dwight called after me, his voice cracking slightly. "You understand this is final. You can't contest any of this later. You've agreed to everything." I didn't turn around, but for the first time that entire horrible evening, I felt the corner of my mouth turn upward into something that almost resembled a smile. The night they thought they destroyed me was the exact night I began planning how to take it all back. Because in Dwight Cummings' terrified eyes, I'd read the one thing he desperately didn't want me to see. They'd made mistakes, serious ones, the kind that leave trails, the kind that prosecutors love. And I had 7 years of silence ahead of me to find every single one. I didn't cry that first night. I opened my laptop instead. The motel room on the outskirts of Kansas City smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and stale cigarette smoke from previous tenants. It was 2 a.m. on September 11th, 2016, exactly 12 hours since I'd signed away everything I owned. The bedspread was tan polyester. The bathroom light flickered. The air conditioner rattled like it was trying to decide whether to die immediately or wait until morning. I sat at the small desk by the window, opened my laptop, and typed Missouri Separate Property Law Divorce Inherited Assets Business Capital. I didn't cry because crying is what broken people do when they believe there's nothing left. And I wasn't broken. I was furious. There's a difference. My finance degree from Washington University, the one I'd earned before, Lester convinced me to abandon my career to help him build his, came back to me like muscle memory. I'd spent 30 years setting it aside, pretending I was just the supportive wife who happened to be good with numbers. But that night, sitting in a $40 a night motel room with everything I owned packed into 2 suitcases in the corner, I remembered exactly who I used to be. I read until 4 a.m. Most of it was dense legal language about marital property division, equitable distribution, commingling of assets. But then a specific statute caught my eye. Missouri Revised Statute Section 452.330. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. Assets purchased with personal inherited funds can retain separate property status under specific conditions if a clear paper trail proves the source was never commingled with marital assets and if systematic fraud is uncovered during the asset transfer process. I sat back in the cheap desk chair and stared at those words for a long time. Clear paper trail, inherited funds, separate property. I looked at the number I'd written in my notebook earlier that evening, the original seed capital that launched Midwest Freight Solutions back in 1998. The source, the sale of my parents' entire estate, transferred directly into the company's founding account. Every dollar documented, every transaction recorded. My parents had left me that estate specifically. My father had been meticulous about estate planning, paranoid even. He'd worked as a CPA for 40 years and knew exactly how to structure an inheritance to protect it from future claims. He'd told me the week before he died that he'd made sure no one could ever take it away from me. And yet someone had. I kept reading. The statute mentioned systematic fraud as grounds for challenging property division even after finalization. Fraud in the inducement, fraud in the concealment, fraud in the representation of asset valuations. The sky outside the motel window started turning gray with early dawn. I hadn't slept. I didn't want to sleep. I wanted to keep reading, keep searching, keep finding the cracks in the armor they thought was impenetrable. 1 week later, I was sitting on the floor of a tiny temporary office I'd rented on the industrial outskirts of Kansas City. Document crates surrounded me, everything I'd managed to retrieve from our old home before Lester changed the locks. Papers strewn across the wooden floor in organized piles, corporate filings, audit reports, tax returns, bank statements, legal correspondence. I was looking for one specific document. It took me 3 hours of digging before I found it in a manila folder marked Midwest Freight 2014 Financial Crisis. I pulled it out carefully, my hands steadier than they'd been in weeks. The debt report that Lester had handed me back in 2014. The document proving Midwest Freight was on the verge of bankruptcy, showing nearly $1 million in outstanding liabilities, vendor defaults pending lawsuits, imminent collapse. The document that had sent me into panic that made me call the bank immediately to liquidate my parents' home, the last physical thing I had left of them to save the company. I remembered that day clearly. Lester had stood in our kitchen with his face gray and worried, holding that report like a death certificate. He'd said we had maybe 2 weeks before the creditors forced us into Chapter 11. He'd said we'd lose everything if I didn't act fast. And I'd believed him. Now I placed that report on the left side of my makeshift desk, a piece of plywood balanced on 2 file boxes. And next to it, I placed the actual external audit report from the same period. The independent third-party assessment that every company our size was required to file annually with the state. The numbers did not match. Not close, not slightly off, completely different. The fraudulent internal report showed $847,000 in liabilities. The actual audit showed $123,000 in routine operational debt, well within normal parameters for a company our size, with assets exceeding liabilities by a comfortable margin. Someone had manufactured a financial crisis that never existed. I cross-referenced 3 more documents, quarterly cash flow statements, vendor payment records, the corporate line of credit balance. Every single piece of external verification told the same story. In 2014, Midwest Freight Solutions was healthy, profitable, growing. There was no crisis. There was only a forged document designed to terrify me into liquidating the one asset they couldn't touch through divorce, my separate inheritance. I looked at the signature block on the fraudulent debt report, certified and verified by Dwight Cummings' corporate financial counsel. His pen, his name, his crime. Now I understood why he'd been so terrified in that corridor, why his hands shook when he set down the divorce papers, why he couldn't look me in the eye. He knew I was smart enough to figure it out eventually. He knew that if I ever compared that internal report to the actual audits, if I ever looked closely at the timeline and the signatures, and the convenient crisis that materialized exactly when they needed to access my inheritance, the entire fraud would unravel. And his name was written in ink across the evidence. I placed the two documents side by side and stared at them for hours as the afternoon light slanted through the office window. They didn't just take my money in 2014, they took the last house that held any warmth of my parents, the place where my mother's garden still bloomed every spring, the porch where my father used to read the newspaper on Sunday mornings. And Dwight Cummings had put his signature on the document that stole it. The copy of my father's will that Dwight gave me was missing something. I just had to prove it. Dwight's signature on that fraudulent debt report wasn't just evidence of one crime, it was proof of a pattern. If he'd forged financial documents to steal my inheritance, he'd probably altered legal documents too. The most important one being my father's will. I'd received my copy when my father passed away in 1998. Dwight had handled the estate paperwork, personally delivered it in a sealed manila envelope. I'd been too grief-stricken to read it carefully. I'd trusted the document was complete. Now I trusted nothing. In October of 2016, I drove to the notary public office in suburban Springfield, where my father had filed his legal documents. The office was in an old brick building near the courthouse with heavy oak desks and brass lamps. Mr. Harlan Fletcher, the elderly notary who had worked there for 40 years, peered over his reading glasses at me when I explained what I needed. "Original registry copy of your father's will," he repeated. "Filed in 1998. Let me retrieve the scanned document from our archives." He printed it slowly and handed me the stack with careful ceremony. I sat down at the reading table and compared it page by page to the copy Dwight had given me 18 years ago. The first 5 pages were identical. Standard will language about distribution of physical property bank accounts, personal effects. My mother received the house. I received the investment portfolio and life insurance proceeds. But the original version had a 6th page, a codicil, added 3 months after the main document was executed. Dated December 15, 1998, exactly 2 weeks after Lester and I had incorporated Midwest Freight Solutions. I read it 3 times, my hands starting to shake. The codicil stated in precise legal language that any asset inherited from my father, if utilized as business capital within a marriage, explicitly retained its status as separate property under Missouri Revised Statute Section 452.330. Furthermore, the right to reclaim said property would be exempt from standard statutes of limitation in cases of proven systematic fraud or deliberate concealment. My father had written me a legal shield, and Dwight had removed it from my copy. "Your father was incredibly meticulous," Mr. Fletcher said quietly. He came back 3 times to make sure that codicil was worded exactly right. He wanted to make absolutely certain it would hold up in court if it was ever needed. He was worried about something specific. He never said directly, but he asked me a lot of questions about asset protection in the event of divorce or business dissolution. This was in 1998. You'd only been married about 5 years at that point. My father had seen it coming. 24 years before Lester destroyed me in that ballroom, my father had looked at my marriage and seen the possibility of betrayal. And he'd quietly, methodically built me a legal escape route. He'd left me the key. I just needed to find the right lock. I paid Mr. Fletcher for 3 certified copies of the complete original will and drove back to Kansas City with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. In November, I sat in a small conference room in an independent law firm on the outskirts of Kansas City. I deliberately avoided Springfield attorneys. Too many connections to Lester's business network. Too many people who'd been at that anniversary gala and done nothing. Christine Merrick, the independent corporate attorney I'd found through careful research, specialized in asset fraud cases involving marital dissolution. She'd never lost a case built on systematic forgery. Her office was sparse and professional, white walls, steel furniture, stark fluorescent lighting. I laid out the complete case file. The forged debt report from 2014, the actual audit reports showing the company was healthy, the missing codicil from my father's will, the divorce papers signed under duress, the paper trail showing where my inherited funds had gone. She reviewed everything in silence for 20 minutes, then looked up. "You have a solid case," she said, "but it will require at least 5 to 6 years of preparation and absolute proof of systematic fraud, not isolated incidents. Furthermore, you'll need someone inside their operation willing to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Financial fraud of this magnitude typically requires insider testimony to secure conviction." "I understand. The statute of limitations for fraud discovery in Missouri is 5 years from the date you reasonably should have discovered the fraud. That means you have until September of 2021 at the absolute latest to file your initial claim. I'd recommend filing by March of 2021 to be safe, well within the window specified by Section 516.120. I need you to file the initial claim before March 2021. I said, my voice steady, strictly matching the statute requirements. Everything after that, I have plenty of time to orchestrate. Christine Merrick stared at me for a long moment. "You've already mapped this out?" "Yes." "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the night I signed the divorce papers." People often ask me later how I stayed patient for 7 years. The answer is simple. I knew exactly what the law required, and I knew I had enough time to build it. 5 years to gather evidence. 2 more years to position everything perfectly. 7 years total to transform from victim into architect of their complete destruction. I turned off my old Springfield phone that night, changed to a new number that only 3 people had: my attorney, my son, and my daughter. No one from my old life. No one who could report back to Lester or Holly or Dwight about what I was doing or where I was or what I'd discovered. And I began the real work. 7 years felt like an eternity and an instant all at once. But I had the law, I had the evidence, and I had something they would never expect from the broken woman who'd walked out of that ballroom: absolute patience. Delaware has 3 advantages: anonymity, speed, and nobody in Missouri needs to know your name. 18 months after the divorce, in the spring of 2018, I sat in my small Kansas City office overlooking a quiet park and filed the paperwork to establish my first shell company. The process took 72 hours. Under Delaware law, limited liability companies can have completely anonymous beneficial owners if you use a nominee proxy, someone whose name appears on the public record, while yours remains invisible. I paid a Delaware corporate services firm $3,000 to serve as my nominee. My name appeared nowhere on any public document. The company existed. It had a bank account. It could enter into contracts, purchase assets, and sue or be sued in court. But if anyone tried to trace the ownership, they'd hit a brick wall of perfectly legal corporate opacity. I called it Townsend Capital Holdings, a small joke for myself that no one else would ever understand. Gregory Whitmore, the independent accountant I hired from Kansas City, specialized in corporate restructuring and understood exactly how to structure anonymous debt purchases through layered intermediaries. He was in his mid-50s, methodical, and asked exactly 0 questions about why a woman with no apparent business history wanted to quietly acquire distressed corporate debt in the logistics sector. He simply said, "I can structure this so that even a forensic audit would take 6 months to trace back to you, and by then you'll own enough leverage to make the audit irrelevant." I liked him immediately. The strategy was simple: buy small pieces of Midwest Freight Solutions corporate debt from institutions that wanted out. Regional banks trying to reduce exposure to the trucking sector, small investment funds that needed liquidity and didn't want to hold defaulted paper through another quarter, private lenders who'd made bad bets and needed to offload before their own investors started asking questions. Every transaction was small, never more than $50,000. Each was routed through a different intermediary, one through a Pennsylvania asset management firm, another through a Texas debt broker, a third through an Indiana private equity fund. The transactions were spread across 6 months, structured to look like routine secondary market activity that happens thousands of times daily in American finance. Nobody connected the dots because there were no dots to connect. Each purchase looked isolated, unremarkable, exactly the kind of distressed debt trading that keeps the financial system liquid. By autumn of 2018, I secretly controlled 23% of the total outstanding debt of Midwest Freight Solutions. Not a single person in Springfield, not the board members, not the accountants, not Lester or Holly or Dwight, recognized my involvement because my name appeared on exactly 0 documents they could access. I worked from my Kansas City office most days. It was a small space on the 3rd floor of an old building near the park. 1 desk, 2 filing cabinets, a laptop, and a window that let in good afternoon light. I kept it deliberately sparse. No photos, no personal items, nothing that would identify who I was or what I was building. People often underestimate the power of patience in corporate warfare. Wall Street moves in quarters. Investors demand results every 90 days. CEOs optimize for the next earnings call. But real power, the kind that dismantles empires, moves in years. I'd spent 18 months building a position so quietly that my target didn't even know I existed in his world anymore. And every month, Gregory brought me the reports. Midwest Freight Solutions was expanding. Lester had won 3 major contracts with national retailers. The company was borrowing heavily to finance new warehouses, new trucks, new distribution centers across the Midwest. Revenue was up. Profits looked strong on paper. And debt was climbing steadily. Every expansion required more capital. Every new contract demanded infrastructure investment before the revenue arrived. Lester was doing exactly what ambitious CEOs do, leveraging future growth to build present capacity. He had no idea that a significant portion of the debt funding his expansion was held by shell companies controlled by the exact same woman he'd forced to sign divorce papers on a hotel corridor table while threatening her grandchildren. The reports came monthly. Gregory would print them out. He was old school about paper trails, and we'd review them together in my office. Total debt position increased another 4% this quarter, he'd say, sliding the spreadsheet across the desk. They're taking on leverage faster than revenue growth, classic overexpansion pattern. How long before it becomes unsustainable? Depends on the economy. If logistics demand stays strong, maybe 3 to 4 years. If we hit a recession or supply chain disruption, 18 months tops. I nodded and filed the report with the others. I wasn't hoping for a recession. I didn't need external circumstances to destroy Lester. I just needed him to keep doing exactly what he was doing, building bigger, borrowing more, growing faster, convinced that his empire was unshakable. Every month, the reports showed the same pattern. Expansion, leverage, more borrowing, more growth built on more debt. Lester thought he was building an empire. He had no idea he was building it on sand I controlled. In October of 2018, I sat in my office and reviewed the quarterly summary. 23% of outstanding debt, structured across 17 different shell entities, purchased at an average of 62 cents on the dollar because distressed debt always sells at a discount. If I wanted to, I could call the debt tomorrow, demand immediate repayment, force restructuring, trigger default cascades that would collapse his entire operation. But that wasn't the plan. Debt was leverage. Debt was a knife I could hold to his throat for years before deciding whether to cut. Debt gave me the legal standing to demand documentation, to challenge decisions, to force disclosures that he'd never willingly provide. But debt alone wouldn't prove systematic fraud. Debt alone wouldn't put him in federal prison. Debt alone wouldn't give me back what he'd stolen. For that, I needed something far more valuable. I needed evidence from inside the company. I needed someone who understood the fraud from the inside and was willing to testify. I needed the kind of documentation that Lester and Holly and Dwight thought they'd buried so deep that no one would ever find it. By October of 2018, I owned 23% of his debt and 0% of his secrets. That was about to change. The encrypted message arrived at 2:47 in the morning with no text, just a file transfer request and my son's name. I'd been asleep in my small Kansas City apartment laptop on the nightstand in case Gregory sent urgent reports. The notification sound pulled me awake instantly. I sat up, opened the secure messaging application, and stared at the screen. Desmond Townsend. 2 years of silence. 2 years since the divorce. Since I'd walked out of that hotel corridor and disappeared into my new invisible life. 2 years of wondering if my son blamed me, hated me, had chosen his father despite everything. 2 years of not knowing whether I'd lost my child along with my marriage. The message contained a video call request and a single encrypted file package marked Internal Records 2013 to 2018. I clicked accept. My son Desmond, 34, appeared on the screen after 2 years of silence. Same quiet eyes, same careful expression. But something in his posture told me he'd been carrying this weight alone for far too long. He sat in front of a plain white wall with no identifying marks. No photos, no windows, nothing that would reveal his location. His first word was simple. "Mom." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed completely. "I don't have much time," he continued, his voice low and controlled. "I'm sending you 5 years of internal accounting records from Midwest Freight Solutions, dual ledger documentation, the real books and the ones they filed with the IRS offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, ghost contracts with dummy shell entities that exist only on paper, everything." I found my voice. "Desmond, where have you been?" "Inside," he said. "I've been inside the company the entire time. Junior auditor position that nobody pays attention to. Low level enough that Lester barely remembers I exist, high enough that I have access to the financial systems." "You've been working for him." "I've been documenting him," Desmond corrected quietly. "For 2 years. Every fraudulent transaction, every offshore transfer, every ghost contract designed to hide taxable revenue from federal authorities. I couldn't stand with him, Mom. I never could. This is everything I managed to pull from the inside. The file transfer completed, 5 gigabytes of compressed data. You need to know something." Desmond continued. "He doesn't know it's me. I used a different surname when I applied my wife's maiden name. Listed a different home address, scrubbed my resume of anything connecting me to you or to the family. As far as Lester knows, I'm just another junior accountant who does what he's told and doesn't ask questions. Does he know you're my son?" "He knows he has a son named Desmond somewhere, but he hasn't seen me since the divorce. I've made sure we're never in the same room. I work night shifts when he's at board meetings. I take assignments at the satellite offices when he's at headquarters. As far as he's concerned, his son disappeared along with his ex-wife." I stared at my son's face on the screen, this man who'd spent 2 years living a double life gathering evidence piece by piece, while I did the same from the outside. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because if you knew, you might have tried to contact me. And if anyone traced that contact back, the whole operation would collapse. You needed to build your case from the outside without knowing what I was doing on the inside. 2 independent investigations that would eventually converge into something impossible to defend against." People ask me later if I was angry he waited 2 years to contact me. The answer is no, because the moment I saw that file, I understood he'd been building this case from the inside while I built mine from the outside. 2 parallel strategies that neither of us discussed, but both of us executed with the same methodical patience. We were more alike than I'd ever realized. "Mom," Desmond said quietly, "I need you to know something. That night in the ballroom when Lester said those things about you when Holly threatened the grandchildren I left, I walked out before the speeches even finished. I couldn't sit there and watch them destroy you." "I know. I wanted to do something immediately. Wanted to tell everyone in that room the truth. But you didn't do that. You signed the papers and walked away. And I realized you were playing a longer game, so I decided to play the same game, from the inside." The video call lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, I sat in the dark apartment staring at the file package on my screen. I didn't open it right away. I just expanded the directory structure to see how he'd organized the evidence. 5 years of documentation, organized by fiscal year, then by type of fraud, then by entity involved. Each subfolder labeled with precise legal terminology: tax evasion, offshore transfers, fraudulent debt instruments, ghost entity contracts, revenue concealment. I stared at the file names and realized this wasn't just evidence. This was my son's way of telling his mother that he had never left her side. He'd been there all along, working in the shadows, gathering the exact proof I needed, while I gathered leverage from the outside. The file organization itself was meticulous. Every document cross-referenced, every transaction traced through multiple entities, every offshore account linked back to source funds. This wasn't the work of 2 years, this was the work of someone who'd been watching and documenting for far longer, maybe even before the divorce, maybe from the moment he'd realized what his father actually was. I heard his voice in every directory name, his precision, his careful patience, his absolute refusal to leave any detail unverified. I sat there until 5 in the morning staring at the screen. 5 years of dual ledger accounting, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, ghost contracts with dummy shell entities, everything federal prosecutors would need to build a case that would survive any defense attorney Lester could afford. My son had just handed me the insider cooperation my lawyer said was essential. He'd been there all along. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Dwight and Holly had resources too, legal teams, political connections, the ability to drag any litigation out for years, while bleeding me dry with procedural motions. I needed more than documents. I needed an ally with the resources to match Lester's power. Someone with their own reasons to want him destroyed. The man standing next to me at the St. Louis convention was also watching Lester, but his expression was pure calculated disdain. 6 months after my son sent me the encrypted files, I attended the Midwestern Regional Logistics Summit in St. Louis, spring of 2019. The cocktail lounge had amber lighting leather chairs, the sound of ice clinking in expensive glasses. I'd come to watch my enemy from across the room to see what version of himself he was selling to the industry now. Lester stood on the small stage near the bar delivering his usual performance. Booming voice, expansive gestures, the charisma that had once convinced me he was building something meaningful. The empire I built with my own 2 hands, he was saying, represents the future of integrated logistics, vertical integration, proprietary systems, complete control of the supply chain from origin to delivery. The man beside me made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something darker. I glanced at him. Mid-50s expensive suit, worn comfortably, the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. He was watching Lester with the expression of someone calculating exactly how much damage they could do if they chose to. "You know him?" I asked quietly. The man turned to me, and for a moment we simply looked at each other with the recognition that sometimes passes between people who understand the same game. "I know his methods," he said. "He is currently presenting a proprietary logistics framework that I licensed to one of his subsidiaries 3 years ago. The agreement included strict non-disclosure provisions and territorial restrictions. He violated both, poached the contract, and walked away. I know exactly how he did it," I said. The man studied me more carefully. "Who are you?" "The person who actually built that company. We didn't exchange business cards. We simply stood there drinking wine for the next 45 minutes, watching Lester perform for an audience that didn't know they were watching a fraud. We didn't discuss strategy or coordination or legal approaches. We simply existed in the same space, watching the same target, understanding without words that we were both building something that would eventually converge." When the presentation ended and the crowd dispersed, the man nodded once and walked away. I didn't learn his name until my investigator called me the next morning. Lyle Hoffman, 54 years old, owner of 17 shipping terminals across 6 states, the largest independent shipping magnate in the Midwest, built his empire on handshakes that meant something and contracts that held up in court, and he was hunting for the exact same weapon I was building. Sometimes the most important alliances form without a single business card exchanged. 2 years later, in the spring of 2021, I stood in the courtyard of the Hoffman estate for the first time. The afternoon sunlight was soft and golden. The lawns were pristine. Everything about the place spoke of wealth that had been earned through decades of careful work rather than shortcuts and fraud. Desmond was already there, standing near the stone patio, and on Lyle's lap sat a small child I'd never met. Kellen, 2 years old, Desmond's son. The child who'd made my son and Lyle Hoffman family 3 years ago when Desmond married Lyle's daughter. the same daughter who died in a car accident 2 months earlier in March of 2021, leaving Lyle and Desmond to navigate shared grief and shared custody of a toddler who didn't understand why his mother wasn't coming home. Mrs. Townsend. Lyle said quietly, his voice gentler than it had been at the St. Louis convention. "This is Kellen." The child looked at me with his grandfather's blue eyes and a smile that knew nothing of the adult world's complications. He reached out his small arms, wanting to be held with the complete trust that children give before the world teaches them caution. I carefully took him into my arms. I hadn't held a child since Desmond was an infant, and the weight of this small person felt both foreign and instantly familiar. He looked around from his new vantage point completely content, secure in the assumption that any adult his grandfather introduced him to must be safe. I looked at Desmond, then at Lyle, then down at the child in my arms. A profound thought took root. This is what it's all for. Not revenge, not vindication, not even justice in the abstract legal sense. This child. This family that had formed through tragedy and alliance and the quiet work of building something real in the wreckage of what Lester had destroyed. People often ask me when I knew this case was about more than revenge. The answer is the moment a 2-year-old boy fell asleep on my shoulder and I understood what legacy actually means. Kellen fell asleep against my shoulder 15 minutes later, his breathing soft and even one small hand curled into my jacket. I sat entirely motionless, terrified of waking him. Desmond watched from across the patio with an expression I couldn't quite read, grief and gratitude, and something else, maybe relief that his son would know his grandmother, that the family fractured by divorce wasn't completely broken. For the first time in 5 years, my mind wasn't occupied by a legal dossier or financial leverage or strategic timelines. I was simply a grandmother holding her grandson in the afternoon sunlight, feeling the weight of him and understanding that everything I'd built, the shell companies, the debt positions, the evidence files, the alliance with Lyle was ultimately about protecting this. Protecting the ability of this child to grow up in a world where fraud has consequences, where theft doesn't go unpunished, where people like his grandfather Lyle and his father Desmond can build real things that last because they're built on truth. I looked at the child sleeping peacefully on my shoulder, Desmond's son, Lyle's grandson, my grandson through everything that mattered even though we shared no blood. 7 years ago, I'd lost what I thought was my entire world. I had no idea then that the things that truly mattered could never be signed away on a piece of paper. But sentiment wouldn't win in federal court. Love wouldn't dismantle Lester's fraud or put Dwight and Holly in prison. Kellen's innocent trust wouldn't recover what they'd stolen or prevent them from doing it again to someone else. For that, I needed hard proof of Dwight's deeper betrayals, the kind that would survive any defense attorney and convince federal prosecutors that this wasn't just civil fraud, it was criminal conspiracy that demanded prosecution. The private investigator left his report in a plain manila envelope on my desk, no words, just evidence. Autumn of 2020. Late afternoon in my Kansas City office. The investigator had just departed and I sat alone with the thick envelope feeling its weight before I even opened it. I'd hired him 18 months earlier with specific instructions, trace every financial connection between Dwight Cummings and Holly Bentley, going back to 2014, follow the money, document the timeline, find the proof that would survive cross-examination. The surveillance dossier confirmed what I'd suspected since 2017 when I first started analyzing the patterns in Desmond's encrypted files. Dwight and Holly were secret lovers before Lester ever went public with Holly at that anniversary gala. Their affair had started in 2015, a full year before my public humiliation, which meant Dwight wasn't helping Lester execute a divorce strategy. He was protecting his own interests from the very beginning. The forged debt report in 2014, the altered will the divorce papers drafted months in advance, all of it served Dwight's agenda, not Lester's. Lester was the performance. Dwight was the architect. But the report revealed an even deeper layer that I hadn't anticipated. Dwight maintained an offshore account entirely separate from his joint dealings with Holly. a personal account in the British Virgin Islands that predated their conspiracy by 3 years, money that Holly didn't know existed, an escape fund built slowly and methodically hidden even from his supposed partner. Dwight had been preparing to betray Holly before anyone even thought to ask him. I placed the file down and looked out the window at the Kansas City skyline. The afternoon light was fading. Office workers were leaving their buildings, heading home to families and normal lives that didn't involve 7-year revenge strategies. People often think the most dangerous person is the smartest one. After 30 years in corporate finance, I know better the most dangerous person is the one who is terrified and cornered without an exit. And Dwight had been building his exit since the conspiracy began. He didn't need me to convince him to betray Holly. He was simply waiting for someone to show up with the exact thing he lacked: a viable exit strategy that wouldn't land him in federal prison. I picked up my phone and called Christine Merrick. "It's time," I said. "File the IRS whistleblower report." In early 2021, through my independent legal counsel, I submitted a massive, meticulous whistleblower report to the Internal Revenue Service. The package contained over 2,000 pages of documentation, built entirely from the internal files my son sent in 2018, my private investigator's financial tracking, and my own forensic analysis, dual ledger accounting records, offshore account transfers, ghost entity contracts designed to hide taxable revenue, shell companies in the Cayman Islands that existed only to launder income away from federal oversight, 5 years of systematic tax evasion documented with the kind of precision that prosecutors dream about. The IRS has a formal whistleblower program under Section 7623 that rewards individuals who provide information leading to the collection of unpaid taxes. If the case results in recovery exceeding $2 million, the whistleblower can receive between 15% and 30% of the collected proceeds. I didn't care about the money. I cared about the mechanism. Once the IRS receives a source of this caliber, detailed, cross-referenced, internally consistent, supported by primary documentation, the gears lock into place and turn automatically. The agency assigns investigators. They verify the claims. They open criminal inquiries. They coordinate with the Department of Justice. The machine drives itself. You just have to feed it the right fuel. Concurrently, I instructed Christine to coordinate with the Department of Justice to submit a formal Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty request to Swiss authorities, the MLAT process that enables U.S. prosecutors to compel foreign banks to freeze accounts linked to active federal criminal investigations. It's a complex international process involving treaty obligations, interagency coordination, and bureaucratic protocols that make glaciers look fast. Standard timeline 18 to 24 months from request to enforcement action. The IRS is the slowest machine on earth, Christine warned me. Even with perfect evidence, you're looking at 18 months minimum before they move on anything. I know, I said, and I have exactly enough time. She was quiet for a moment. You've already calculated this. Down to the week. The IRS is the slowest machine on earth. But once you feed it the right evidence, it grinds forward with the inevitability of a glacier, unstoppable, methodical, and completely indifferent to the people in its path. I filed the whistleblower report in February of 2021. 18 months from February 2021 puts enforcement action in August or September of 2023. The FinCEN flag on Holly's Swiss accounts would take the same timeline. Request filed February 2021. International coordination process. Account freeze orders ready by late summer 2023. The civil litigation that Christine had filed in March of 2019, carefully positioned within the 5-year statute of limitations window, would conclude its discovery phase and reach trial-ready status by summer of 2023. Dwight's fear was growing. My private investigator's reports showed him meeting with his personal attorney, more frequently asking questions about immunity deals and cooperation agreements. Lyle and I had been coordinating quietly for 2 years. His shipping empire gave him leverage in the logistics industry that I couldn't access alone. My debt position gave me legal standing that he needed to challenge Lester's contracts. and I had 23% of Lester's corporate debt purchased quietly through shell companies he would never trace back to me. By February of 2021, every gear was in motion. The FinCEN flag would take 18 months ready by September 2023. The civil litigation would conclude by summer 2023. The IRS investigation would reach critical mass in late summer. Dwight's fear would peak exactly when I needed him most vulnerable. Every timeline converging on one night. I just needed to make sure Lester threw himself the perfect celebration, a gala, so public, so arrogant, so convinced of his own invincibility that 200 witnesses would be there to watch it all collapse. The weekly report landed on my desk in mid-2021 with a single word circled in red panic. Lester had thrown himself the perfect celebration. He just didn't know it yet. I opened the investigator's summary and read the field notes carefully. According to the surveillance team, Lester had finally realized that an unknown entity was methodically buying up his corporate debt. His old creditors had been calling to inform him they'd exited their positions to an anonymous third-party buyer. Small transactions, different intermediaries. But when you added them all together, someone now controlled a significant percentage of Midwest Freight Solutions' outstanding obligations. Lester had hired his own private investigators to trace the buyer. They'd spent 3 months and probably $50,000 following the paper trail through regional banks, asset management firms, debt brokers, and shell companies. And they'd hit a brick wall. A continuous chain of Delaware limited liability companies, each one using nominee proxies, each one structured to mask the true beneficial owner. Legal, impenetrable. Exactly as I'd designed it. The report noted that Hawley suspected an aggressive move by Lyle Hoffman, some kind of corporate warfare tactic to destabilize Lester's company and poach his contracts. Lester wasn't sure. He was deeply anxious, entirely powerless to identify the threat, and growing more paranoid by the week. The investigator's summary concluded with a brief line. Subject has ceased active tracking. Believes threat contained, but origin unknown. I folded the paper and set it down on my desk. The operational cover was completely sound. Lester knew someone was hunting him. He just had no idea it was the woman he'd destroyed 7 years ago. In May of 2023, 4 months before the gala, I opened my Kansas City apartment mailbox on a bright Monday morning and found a crisp, heavy white envelope embossed with the gold Regency Hotel logo. Inside was a formal invitation to a massive charity gala hosted by Lester and Holly Greer at the Regency Ballroom, Springfield, Missouri, scheduled for September 13, 2023. The exact month, the exact location. 7 years to the day after he'd destroyed me in that same ballroom, Lester was throwing himself a celebration in the same room where he'd forced me to sign away everything I'd built. I sat with the invitation in my hand for a long moment. I looked at the Regency logo, looked at the date embossed in gold script, looked at the guest list notation, 200 prominent business and political leaders. Then I smiled. Not a warm smile. Not the smile of someone anticipating a pleasant evening. The expression of a general watching an enemy march directly into an entrenched ambush, convinced they're walking toward victory. They chose the venue themselves. They chose the date themselves. They even sent me the invitation, probably some algorithmic mailing list error that included old business contacts, not realizing I still existed in their database. Sometimes you don't need to arrange every piece of the universe. Your enemies will march into place for you. In June of 2023, 3 months before the gala, I sat at the kitchen table in the Hoffman estate on a quiet Sunday evening. The lighting was warm and soft. Kellen, now 4 years old, was asleep in his room down the hall. The television had been off for hours. The house was completely still. Desmond sat across from me, Lyle to my right. We'd been discussing final logistics for over an hour when Desmond asked the question directly. Are you absolutely certain, Mom? Once we trigger this, there is no turning back, no negotiation, no settlement. This goes all the way to the end. I looked toward the hallway that led to Kellen's room. Thought about the child sleeping peacefully, unaware of the adult world's complications. Thought about what kind of man I wanted him to become. This isn't about me and your father anymore, I said quietly. This is about Kellen growing up knowing the unvarnished truth about his family, about understanding that actions have consequences, that fraud doesn't just disappear because time passes, that the people who love him fought to protect something real. Desmond looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Lyle smiled slightly and slid a document forward across the kitchen table. 3 months ago, he said, I quietly acquired the property management contract and settled the outstanding liens on the venue that Lester was using to organize the gala, paid off the primary lien holders, secured the lease on the Regency Ballroom through a private foundation. The legal entity registered with the state of Missouri is the Lorraine Townsend Educational Development Foundation. I stared at the deed transfer document. The foundation I'd established in my father's memory now owned the property where Lester planned to celebrate his empire. He doesn't know, Lyle continued. The charity fund went bankrupt last year. He's been negotiating with administrators who were happy to take his deposits while the ownership quietly changed hands behind the scenes. As far as Lester knows, he's hosting his gala at a venue he controls. But he'll be celebrating in a ballroom I own, I said. Exactly. Desmond looked at his mother, said nothing, simply nodded with the understanding that sometimes passes between family members who've fought the same battle from different angles. That night, for the first time in 7 years, I slept soundly. Not because everything was ready, there were still 100 details to coordinate federal agencies, to synchronize legal documents, to file at precise moments. But because I finally knew I wasn't walking into that room alone. I had my son. I had Lyle. I had Gregory managing the financial leverage. I had Christine coordinating the legal mechanisms. I had Desmond's evidence from inside the company. I had federal prosecutors who'd been building their case for 18 months. And I had something Lester never understood, patience that outlasted fear. We sat at that kitchen table until midnight, 3 people bound by blood and strategy, refining the execution down to the minute. September 13th, 2023. The exact same ballroom, the exact same chandeliers, the exact same white lilies. But this time, I would be the one who owned the room. 72 hours before the gala, the final pieces would fall into place. Judge signatures, IRS coordination, federal warrants, FinCEN account freezes, Dwight's final decision. Everything converging on one night. 7 years of silence, 7 years of building, 7 years of waiting for the exact right moment when every gear locked into place and turned simultaneously. I looked at my son and at Lyle, and I understood what my father had known when he wrote that protective codicil. 25 years ago, real power isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, patient and inevitable, waiting for the moment when those who stole everything finally realize they never owned anything at all. 1 week remained, 7 days to ensure 7 years of strategy converged perfectly. Wednesday, September 6th, 2023. I sat in the private chambers of Missouri State Circuit Court in Kansas City, with Christine Merrick beside me and Judge Jacqueline Redmond across a massive mahogany table. The overhead lighting was cold and fluorescent. Legal filings were stacked in 3 pristine columns between us. Judge Redmond had spent the past 3 weeks studying the case. Every document, every exhibit, every cross-reference in 4 years of litigation that had started quietly in March of 2019, filed precisely within the 5-year statute of limitations window built methodically, while Lester celebrated what he thought was permanent victory. The judge looked up from the final page. The civil judgment ordering rescission and transfer of Midwest Freight Solutions was issued August 25th. She said, "That transfer is legally complete. Mr. Greer no longer holds any ownership interest in the company as of 3 weeks ago. He simply doesn't know it yet." I nodded. That was the point. The law had already moved. The ownership had already changed hands. Everything that would happen on September 13th was merely execution theater. the public revelation of what had already been decided in quiet courtrooms, while Lester threw parties and made speeches about his empire. Tonight, only one procedural step remains. Judge Redmond continued. I need to sign the emergency writ of execution in tandem with the IRS asset seizure warrants. This ensures that no corporate capital can be liquidated or transferred before the public announcement. The timing must be precise. I understand. I will sign the execution order at exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon on September 13th, the judge said. You must ensure that Agent Price activates the federal IRS freeze concurrently. If there's any gap in timing, Greer's attorneys could argue procedural irregularity. It is already synchronized, I said. Agent Price has confirmed the federal systems will execute the freeze at 1700 hours. The technical coordination is complete. Judge Redmond studied me for a moment with the expression of someone who'd spent 30 years on the bench and could recognize preparation when she saw it. 5 p.m., I said quietly. The gala begins at 7 p.m. I have a 2-hour operational cushion, more than enough. 7 years of patience distilled into 120 minutes. The next day, Thursday, September 7th, I sat in a tiny isolated cafe on the far outskirts of Springfield, away from the commercial districts where people might recognize either of us. The corner booth was shrouded in shadow. The lunch crowd had cleared out hours ago. Dwight Cummings walked in at exactly 3 o'clock. 50 years old now, gray at the temples, still wearing expensive suits, but something in his posture had changed since that night 7 years ago when his hands shook while he handed me divorce papers. He looked like a man who'd been waiting for a knock on his door and finally heard it. No pleasantries, no pretense. He sat down across from me and I slid 3 items across the scarred wooden table. First, a complete forensic file detailing his specific role in the 2014 fraud, the forged debt reports with his signature, the altered will with the missing codicil, the timeline of every document he'd prepared or witnessed, everything prosecutors would need to put him in federal prison for a decade. Second, an official envelope from the United States Attorney's Office containing an unexecuted proffer agreement, the kind of deal that prosecutors offer cooperating witnesses limited immunity in exchange for complete testimony. It was already drafted, already reviewed. I was simply the conduit. Third, complete banking details of his hidden personal account in the British Virgin Islands. The account Holly knew nothing about, his secret escape fund. Dwight stared at all 3 documents in absolute silence. Federal prosecutors are finalizing their witness list, I said calmly. I can connect you with the assistant U.S. attorney authorized to execute this deal. The choice is yours. He looked at the 3rd paper, his secret account information that should have been impossible for anyone to find. Then he looked up at me. What do you require? People often ask me how I knew Dwight would cooperate. The answer is simple. Terrified men don't need to be convinced. They need to be offered an exit. They're too afraid to find themselves. Your punctual presence at the gala, I said. Original physical copies of my father's will that you filed with the county. Every text message log you have from Holly going back 7 years. Dwight stared at me for another 30 seconds. Then he looked down at the proffer agreement, at the forensic file, at the account details that proved I knew everything. Saturday, he said quietly. 8 p.m. I will be there. I called the waiter over to pay the bill. The meeting had taken exactly 17 minutes. On my drive back to Kansas City, I thought about the moment 7 years ago when I'd looked into Dwight's eyes and seen terror instead of triumph. That night in the hotel corridor when he'd handed me papers to sign with shaking hands while thinking he was finishing me off. He'd been afraid of me then, not of Lester, not of Holly, of me, of what I knew, of what I could do with that knowledge. And for 7 years, he'd waited. Probably kept the original will documents hidden somewhere Holly couldn't find them. Probably maintained that secret account as insurance against the day when Holly turned on him. Probably woke up some nights wondering when someone would finally piece it all together and come for him. He didn't need me to convince him to betray Holly and Lester. He'd been preparing for this moment since the conspiracy began. He just needed someone to show up with the exit strategy he lacked the courage to execute alone. 17 minutes. That's how long it took for a terrified man to choose survival over loyalty to people who would throw him to federal prosecutors the second it served their interests. I pulled into my Kansas City apartment parking lot as the sun was setting. 5 days until the gala. 5 days until every timeline converged. Judge Redmond would sign at 5 p.m. The IRS would freeze accounts simultaneously. Dwight would appear with evidence at 8 p.m. Federal agents would be positioned and ready. The civil judgment was already issued. The property was already mine. The debt was already controlled. Every piece in position, every gear locked, every timeline synchronized. I went inside and made myself dinner. A quiet Thursday evening. Nothing special, nothing dramatic. 5 days remained. But somewhere in Springfield, Holly had already made a fatal miscalculation of her own. She just didn't know it yet. The encrypted line lit up at 10:47 a.m. Agent Cruz calling 2 days early with intelligence I hadn't requested. Friday, September 8th, 2023. I was sitting in my Kansas City office reviewing final coordination documents when the secure phone started ringing. Special Agent Neil Cruz, 46 from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, had the measured voice of someone who'd spent 20 years watching wealthy people try to outsmart the federal government and fail. "Mrs. Townsend," he said without preamble. Holly Bentley proactively contacted our division yesterday afternoon, September 7th, submitting corporate records incriminating Lester Greer in a desperate bid to secure whistleblower immunity before the net closed around her. I sat completely still for 1 second. Holly Bentley, who had spent 7 years believing she was smarter than everyone in every room, had just walked directly into a trap 18 months in the making. She believes she is a step ahead of everyone. Agent Cruz continued. Her attorney submitted 5 years of dual ledger accounting records, offshore transfer documentation, and ghost entity contracts. She thinks she's the first person to expose the fraud. "The same evidence my son delivered to you in October of 2018, I said. "Correct. She's providing nothing new. But she doesn't know that. She believes she's securing her freedom by betraying Lester." I looked out the window at the Friday morning traffic. Ordinary people driving to ordinary jobs, completely unaware that a few blocks away a federal agent was explaining how a woman had just destroyed herself trying to save herself. "Her Swiss accounts," I said. The DOJ submitted the MLAT request back in March of 2022, correct the international freeze triggers simultaneously alongside your domestic orders this Saturday night. Agent Cruz laughed softly. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "Correct. When we execute the domestic asset freeze tomorrow evening at 1700 hours, the Swiss freeze activates simultaneously through treaty protocols. She won't be able to access a single dollar. So every piece of evidence she just handed you came from their joint account," Agent Cruz finished. "An account funded directly by your stolen capital. Everything she is using to save herself legally binds her to his tax evasion. Every document she signed, every transfer she authorized, every offshore entity she helped establish." I felt something cold and precise settle in my chest. Not joy, not even satisfaction, just the recognition of a machine operating exactly as designed. "She thought she was playing Lester," I said quietly. "She was playing herself." We were silent for a moment. "There's one more detail you should know," he said. "When Holly submitted her evidence yesterday, she specifically requested that we freeze Lester's assets immediately to prevent him from liquidating before arrest. She gave us probable cause to execute the warrants earlier than planned. She accelerated our timeline without realizing it." "Exactly. We were going to wait until Monday to finalize the warrants. Now we can execute Saturday evening as you requested, and her own submission provides the justification." Before I explain what that evidence really meant, are you still here with me? Comment A if you think Holly deserves exactly what's coming, or B if this feels too far and tell me why in 5 to 10 words. Note the next part includes fictionalized details for emotional impact. If that's not for you, feel free to stop here. I set the encrypted phone down and stared at it for a long moment. Holly had spent 7 years believing she was the architect of my destruction. She'd stood beside Lester at that anniversary gala, wearing her diamond ring demanding I sign away everything. She'd threatened my grandchildren. She'd helped Dwight forge documents and build the fraud that stole my life. And yesterday, 4 days before the final convergence, she'd walked into a federal office and handed prosecutors every piece of evidence they needed to prosecute her alongside Lester. Not instead of him, alongside him. She thought she was betraying him. She was confessing for both of them. The joint account she'd used to fund the evidence submission was the same account I'd traced back to the original theft. The offshore entities she was exposing were the same ones her brother Dwight had helped establish. Every document bore her signature. Every transfer showed her authorization. She'd handed federal prosecutors a complete confession while believing she was securing immunity. And she'd done it voluntarily. No subpoena, no warrant, no pressure. She'd walked in on her own, believing she was being clever. Sometimes a traitor builds their own gallows perfectly. You simply have to stand back and wait for the drop. I picked up my regular phone and called Christine Merrick. Agent Cruz just informed me that Holly submitted evidence to the IRS yesterday, I said. I heard, Christine replied. The U.S. Attorney's Office called me this morning. They wanted to know if we had any objection to including Holly Bentley in the criminal referral alongside Lester Greer. What did you tell them? I told them we had no objection whatsoever. I looked out at the Friday afternoon light. 4 days until the gala. 4 days until every timeline converged. 4 days until 200 witnesses watched the trap spring shut. Holly thought she was saving herself. She had no idea she'd just handed federal prosecutors the rope. I set the phone down and opened my laptop. There were final coordination emails to send logistics to confirm details that needed attention before tomorrow evening. But first, I allowed myself one moment of dark satisfaction. 7 years ago, Holly had stood in that ballroom and told me to sign away everything or face harsher measures. She'd threatened my children and grandchildren. She'd worn my stolen inheritance on her finger like a trophy. And yesterday, she'd signed her own confession without anyone even asking. Sometimes revenge doesn't require elaborate schemes. Sometimes you just have to wait for your enemies to destroy themselves while believing they're winning. The night before the gala, I ironed the black silk dress with the same precision I'd applied to every other detail. Holly had destroyed herself yesterday by trying to save herself. That was satisfying, but tonight required something more deliberate, something symbolic. Friday evening, September 12th, 2023. My hotel room in Springfield was quiet and anonymous, the kind of place where business travelers stay for conferences and leave without making an impression. I'd checked in under my own name, no hiding, no false identity, just a woman returning to the city that had watched her humiliation 7 years ago. I opened my suitcase and lifted out the black silk dress. The fabric was still perfect. I'd kept it in preservation storage for 7 years, waiting for this exact moment. I set up the travel iron on the hotel desk and worked methodically, smoothing every fold, pressing every seam until the silk lay flawless and ready. Then I laid it across the bed and stood looking at it. Not because I couldn't afford a new designer gown. I could have bought 10. But I wanted the very first image Lester and Holly saw tonight to flash them back 7 years instantly. The exact same dress, the exact same woman, except the version standing before them tonight would be entirely different. Same costume, different actor. My phone buzzed, Desmond's name on the screen. "Are you all right, Mom?" "Completely." "I love you." "I know." The call ended, brief. No need for more words. We'd said everything that needed saying over the past 7 years. Tonight was simply execution. I stepped into the dress, zipped it carefully, turned to the full-length mirror. I saw the woman from 7 years ago, same dress, same age, same face. But the eyes belonged to someone else entirely, the eyes of someone who already knows the final score. the eyes of someone who spent 7 years building an architecture so perfect that the last 90 seconds are simply watching gears lock into place. I turned off the lights and stepped out into the hotel corridor. The night they thought they destroyed me, I wore this dress. Tonight I would wear it again, same dress, same woman, completely different ending. Saturday, September 13th, 2023, 6:30 in the evening, 30 minutes before the gala doors opened to guests. I stood in a repurposed staging room on the second floor of the Regency Hotel. The lighting was dim. The space smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet. Agent Neil Cruz was conducting final verification of federal communications equipment, encrypted laptops, secure phone lines, the technical infrastructure required to coordinate multiple agencies simultaneously. He looked up when I entered. The federal IRS freeze orders are queued for remote activation the moment the signal is given, he said, perfectly synchronized with the state court enforcement order that Judge Redmond signed at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Every domestic and international account linked to Midwest Freight Solutions will freeze within 90 seconds of initiation, including the Zurich accounts. Confirmed. The DOJ finalized the MLAT coordination with Swiss authorities in March of this year. The Swiss banks are prepared to execute freeze orders simultaneously with our domestic systems. 18 months of treaty coordination. I nodded. 18 months. Part of the timeline I'd calculated back in February of 2021 when I first filed the whistleblower report. Every bureaucratic delay anticipated, every international protocol mapped, every coordination point planned years in advance. The timing is critical, Agent Cruz continued. We have a 90-second window where all systems must execute concurrently. State court, federal, IRS, international banking asset seizure warrants. If any component delays, defense attorneys can argue procedural irregularity. I understand. Your attorney confirmed that the civil judgment transferring company ownership is already final as of August 25th. Tonight is purely enforcement theater. Correct, the law has already moved. Tonight is revelation. People often ask me if I was nervous in those final 30 minutes. The answer is no. When you've spent 7 years building something this precisely, the last 90 seconds are simply watching it unfold exactly as designed. No improvisation, no uncertainty, just mechanics. Agent Cruz looked at me with the expression of someone who'd spent 20 years in federal law enforcement and recognized preparation when he saw it. Are you ready, ma'am? I have been ready for 7 years. He nodded once and returned to his equipment verification. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. Cars arriving, valets rushing, 200 guests in evening wear streaming toward the ballroom entrance. The same people who'd watched my humiliation 7 years ago returning for what they thought was another celebration of Lester's success. They had no idea they were walking into a courtroom. Below me, through the building's side windows, I could see into the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers already lit, white lilies in tall vases, the stage where Lester would deliver his keynote, the same room, the same setup, everything exactly as it had been. Except this time, the property deed had my foundation's name on it. This time, the company ownership had been transferred by court order. This time, federal agents were positioned throughout the building. This time, every account would freeze the moment I gave the signal. This time, I owned the room. 90 seconds. That was the window required for 7 years of silent labor to manifest into concrete reality. 90 seconds for state and federal systems to execute synchronized commands. 90 seconds for offshore accounts to lock. 90 seconds for the trap to spring completely shut. I turned from the window, left the staging room, and walked down the corridor toward the grand staircase. Below me, 200 guests were arriving for the gala. Above me, the chandeliers burned exactly as they had 7 years ago. Around me, federal agents were in position. Behind me, Agent Cruz was ready to execute the freeze orders. And inside the ballroom, Lester Greer was standing on a floor he thought he owned, about to celebrate an empire he thought he'd built, completely unaware that every piece of it had been quietly transferred away from him weeks ago. He had no idea whose floor he was standing on. 30 years building an empire with my own 2 hands. Lester's voice boomed through the ballroom as I stood in the shadows listening. 7:15 p.m. I stood in the corridor just outside the ballroom, the door cracked open barely an inch. Enough to see, enough to hear, not enough to be seen. Lester Greer, 76 years old, now stood center stage under the crystal chandeliers, gripping the microphone with the confidence of someone who believed he'd earned everything he had. 30 years ago, he continued his voice, carrying across 200 guests in evening wear. I started with absolutely nothing, no inheritance, no advantages, just 2 hands and a determination to build something that would last. Not a single word about the woman who engineered the books. Not a single syllable about the inherited capital she sacrificed. Not one mention of the 60-hour weeks she worked while he took credit at board meetings. Only his 2 hands and his self-made empire. I stepped back from the door. Whose 2 hands, Lester? I checked my watch. 7:27 p.m. 3 minutes left before the timeline required my entrance. I could hear him still talking, listing his accomplishments, thanking Holly for her unwavering support, acknowledging the mayor and prominent business leaders who'd joined them tonight. I placed my palm on the heavy brass door handles, took one breath, and pushed them open. The doors were heavy and well-oiled. They swung wide with barely a sound, but the movement caught the attention of guests near the entrance. Heads turned. Conversations paused. A ripple of recognition spreading through the crowd. Holly Bentley, 57, spotted me first. She was standing near the stage with a microphone in her hand, preparing to introduce the next segment of the program. Her eyes went wide for a fraction of a second before her expression shifted into something that looked like theatrical concern. "Oh, look, everyone," she said, her voice amplifying across the room through the sound system. "Is that Lorraine? The poor ex-wife actually found her way here tonight. Did you come to beg for a handout from our new charity foundation?" Lester turned toward me, his face splitting into a smirk. He raised his lapel microphone. "Lorraine," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Please, retain what little dignity you have left. This room is reserved for people of actual substance, not penniless onlookers who couldn't manage their own finances." The room fell into dead, awkward silence. 200 people staring. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked curious. Most looked away, embarrassed to be witnessing what they assumed was another humiliation. They were waiting for me to shatter, waiting for me to cry or leave or defend myself with desperate explanations. They had no idea that the woman standing before them had spent 7 years becoming someone who no longer needed their approval to exist. I didn't falter, didn't flinch. Instead, I let the corner of my mouth curl into a small, steady smile. And Holly's voice suddenly faltered, because something in that smile told her I knew something she didn't. The heavy entrance doors opened a second time. 7:29 p.m., exactly 60 seconds after my entrance. Flashbulbs from press photographers invited to document Lester's charity gala pivoted away from the stage and pointed directly toward the entrance. Lyle Hoffman, 58, walked in carrying the unmistakable aura of a man who owns the landscape he's standing on. Tailored suit, calm expression, the kind of quiet power that doesn't need to announce itself. And holding his hand, Kellen, 4 years old, wearing a tailored vest and a crooked Springfield Cardinals cap that kept sliding forward over his eyes. Kellen's eyes scanned the crowd searching, then they locked onto me. He broke free from his grandfather's grip and sprinted across the polished ballroom floor, his small dress shoes slapping against the parquet. "Grandma," he shouted, his voice carrying in the shocked silence. "Grandfather and I have been looking everywhere for you. You promised me there would be chocolate cake tonight at your new foundation launch." I dropped to one knee and caught Kellen perfectly in my arms. The champagne glass in Lester's hand slipped. It hit the floor and shattered into 1,000 pieces, the sound echoing through the dead silent ballroom like a gunshot. In the silence that followed, you could hear the sound of Lester's entire world beginning to collapse alongside it. Kellen wrapped his arms around my neck, completely oblivious to the 200 frozen guests staring at us. He pulled back and looked at me with the serious expression of a 4-year-old who'd been promised something important. "You said there would be chocolate cake with the strawberries on top," he said. "The kind from the bakery with your name on it." "There will be." I said quietly. I promise. I stood up, lifting Kellen with me, and turned to face the ballroom. Lester's face had gone completely pale. His eyes locked onto Lyle Hoffman standing at the entrance, then darted to me holding Kellen, then to the shattered champagne glass at his feet. Holly's microphone hung loose in her hand, forgotten. Judge Jacqueline Redmond sat at a table near the front, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp and watchful. Beside her, Mayor Wendell Ashford shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly very interested in his water glass. Kellen said the words, "Your new foundation launch," and I watched the precise microsecond the reality hit Lester's face. The sudden terrifying realization. He'd been standing here for an hour greeting guests, making speeches about his charity gala, his generosity, his success. He'd publicly humiliated me via microphone, calling me penniless and pathetic. And he had no idea whose floor he was standing on. The Regency Ballroom. The property he thought he controlled. The venue he'd booked for his triumphant celebration. Every inch of it belonged to the Lorraine Townsend Educational Development Foundation. Had belonged to it since March, purchased quietly while he sent out invitations and planned his speeches. Lyle Hoffman walked slowly across the ballroom floor toward us, his footsteps measured and deliberate. He stopped beside me, placed one hand on Kellen's shoulder, and looked directly at Lester. No words, just that steady, unwavering gaze. And Lester finally understood. Not just the property, not just the foundation, the alliance, the family, the grandson connecting two empires, the 7 years of silence that had rebuilt everything he thought he'd destroyed. The champagne glass lay shattered at his feet, and the night had only just begun. Lyle Hoffman walked through the frozen crowd like he owned the room, because in every way that mattered, he did. The champagne glass lay shattered at Lester's feet. The ballroom had fallen into shocked silence. 200 guests stared at Kellen in my arms, at Lyle, advancing steadily toward the stage, at Lester's pale face as understanding began to dawn. Lyle didn't rush, didn't gesture aggressively. He simply walked with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades building an empire on handshakes that meant something, and he was about to deliver information that would end another man's career. He stepped onto the stage. The MC, some hired event coordinator who'd been managing the evening's program, instinctively stepped aside, microphone forgotten in his hand. Lyle took it, gently tested it once, then turned to face the room. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and clear. "I'm Lyle Hoffman. The child you just met is my grandson, Kellen. He's also Lorraine Townsend's grandson, which makes him the living bridge between our two families." Lester gripped the edge of the podium, his knuckles white. The alliance Mr. Greer mentioned in his remarks earlier. Lyle continued, "Isn't coming. It's been here for 7 years. Every restructuring, every audit, every foundation transfer. We've been rebuilding what was stolen, one asset at a time." The room erupted in whispers. Phones came out. People started recording. This wasn't a charity gala anymore. This was something else entirely. "This is my company," Lester said, his voice weak and strained through his lapel microphone. "My building. You have no authority here." Lyle looked at him with the expression of someone explaining basic facts to a child. "Your company," he repeated. "Let me address that." Several board members near the back began moving toward the exits. Lyle raised one hand, a simple gesture, and they froze. Because that gesture suggested there was more to reveal, much more, and leaving now would only make them look complicit when it all came out. The alliance between the Hoffman and Townsend families became operational in October of 2016, Lyle said, shortly after Mrs. Townsend was forced to sign divorce papers under what can only be described as coercive circumstances. For 7 years, we've been working from inside Midwest Freight Solutions' financial structure, documenting irregularities, coordinating with federal authorities, and systematically unwinding the fraud. I set Kellen down gently, his small hand gripping mine. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes on me now. No longer the penniless ex-wife Holly had mocked 30 seconds ago. Something else entirely. Holly broke the silence with a sound that was half laugh, half shriek. "Security!" she screamed, her voice rising to near hysteria. "This man is trespassing. Lester owns this building. We're hosting this gala. Remove him immediately." Her voice echoed off the chandeliers. Several society guests shifted uncomfortably suddenly, very aware that their names would be associated with whatever was about to unfold. Mayor Ashford whispered urgently to an aide. Judge Redmond sat perfectly still, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp with recognition of legal implications. Lyle waited for Holly's voice to fade before responding. When he did, his tone was ice-cold precision. "Actually, Ms. Bentley Mr. Greer hasn't owned this property since December of 2020. The deed was transferred to the Lorraine Townsend Educational Development Foundation as part of a legitimate purchase transaction, all public record properly filed with the county fully documented." Holly's face drained of color. The Regency Hotel ballroom. Lyle continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The building that houses it and the property it sits on have belonged to Mrs. Townsend's foundation for nearly 3 years. Every guest here tonight, including Mr. and Mrs. Greer, has been standing on Lorraine's floor since the moment they walked in." He paused, letting that sink in. This isn't his gala, it's hers. The room erupted. Not in applause or outrage, but in the chaotic sound of 200 people, all trying to process the same impossible information simultaneously. Conversations, exclamations, the scraping of chairs as people stood up to see better, the click of phone cameras. Lester swayed slightly, gripping the podium for support. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I watched him from across the ballroom. This man who'd stood in this same room 7 years ago and called me a withered shadow he'd stayed with from pity. This man who'd forced me to sign away everything while threatening my grandchildren. This man who'd spent 3 decades taking credit for work I'd done. He finally understood. Not just the property, not just the alliance, the scope of it. 7 years of silence while I rebuilt everything from nothing. 7 years of his company being systematically dismantled from within, while he threw parties and made speeches. 7 years of standing on ground he thought was his, while it shifted beneath his feet. "You're lying!" Holly said, her voice breaking. "Show me proof. Show everyone here proof of what you're claiming. You can't just walk in here and—" Lyle pulled a small remote from his jacket pocket. He pressed a single button. Behind him, 6 enormous LED screens began descending from the ceiling with a mechanical hum that cut through every whisper in the room. They'd been hidden in the ceiling infrastructure installed during the foundation's renovation of the property, waiting. The screens locked into place with a soft click. 6 massive displays, each one easily 12 feet wide, positioned so that every guest in the ballroom had a clear view. Lyle looked at Holly with an expression that might have been pity if it contained any warmth at all. "Since Ms. Bentley asked for proof," he said quietly, "let's start with the property deed, and then we'll move on to the other documents." The first screen flickered to life, and I watched Lester's face as he realized this wasn't just a revelation. This was a presentation, with exhibits, with documentation, with evidence that had been prepared and organized and timed to unfold exactly like this. 7 years of silence, 90 seconds of execution, and 200 witnesses who would never forget what they saw tonight. The first document filled all 6 screens in perfect clarity property deed for 1847 Kingsbridge Boulevard, transferring ownership from Greer Holdings, LLC, to Lorraine Townsend Educational Development Foundation, dated December 18, 2020. The screens told the story I lived. High resolution, official seals, county stamps, every detail visible to 200 witnesses who couldn't look away even if they wanted to. The ballroom fell into absolute silence as guests craned their necks to read. Some pulled out phones and started recording. Others simply stared, processing what this meant. The building they were standing in, the gala they were attending, the charity Lester claimed to be launching, all of it on property he didn't own. A woman near the front whispered to her husband, her voice carrying in the silence. "That's a notary seal, official. God, that's from 23 years ago. Holly hissed something at Lester that I couldn't hear, but I could see her lips form the words, "Say something. Stop this." Lester said nothing. He stood frozen at the podium, staring at the screens like a man watching his own execution. After 15 seconds, the screens transitioned smoothly to the second document. The original 1998 last will and testament of my father, notarized, filed with the county, complete with the separate property codicil dated September 3, 1998, before Lester and I were even married. The codicil text was large enough for everyone to read. Any asset inherited by Lorraine Margaret Townsend from this estate, if utilized as business capital within any marriage, shall explicitly retain its status as separate property not subject to marital division under Missouri Revised Statute Section 452.330. My father had seen it coming 25 years ago, had written it into law, had protected me before I even knew I needed protection. Guests were openly talking now, pointing at the screens, reading sections aloud to each other. The quiet murmur of 200 people all realizing the same thing simultaneously. This wasn't a presentation. This was a legal case being laid out in real time. I didn't move, didn't speak. Let the screens do what 7 years of silence couldn't. The displays split into side-by-side comparison. Left screen. A debt report dated February 2014 showing Midwest Freight Corporation with $847,000 in outstanding liabilities, vendor defaults, pending lawsuits, imminent bankruptcy. Signed at the bottom, Dwight Cummings Corporate Financial Counsel. Right screen. The actual external audit report from the same period, certified by an independent accounting firm, showing $1.2 million in assets. 0 problematic debt, healthy cash flow, growing revenue. The visual comparison made the fraud undeniable. Every number altered, every projection falsified. The same company, the same month, 2 completely different financial pictures. One real, one manufactured to terrify me into liquidating my inheritance. Holly's face drained of color as she stared at Dwight's signature on the fraudulent report. "Those are forgeries," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is slander. We'll sue every single person involved in this." Lyle cut her off with the calm precision of someone stating facts. "The documents were authenticated by 3 independent forensic analysts," he said. "Their reports are Exhibits 12 through 14 available for any attorney who wishes to review them." Someone near the back shouted a question I couldn't quite hear. Then someone else. The room was fracturing. Alliances dissolving in real time. People who'd come here to celebrate Lester's success now trying to distance themselves as fast as possible. Mayor Ashford leaned to his aide, his voice loud enough to carry. "Get me out of here, now." The screens transitioned again. Missouri State Circuit Court judgment, dated August 25, 2023, case number 23-CVI-8847. The court orders immediate rescission and transfer of all ownership interests in Midwest Freight Solutions from Lester Greer to Lorraine Townsend, pursuant to Missouri Revised Statute, Section 452.330 separate property provisions fraud in the inducement and systematic concealment of marital assets. 3 weeks ago. The judgment was 3 weeks old. Lester had been celebrating an empire that had already been transferred away from him, had been hosting galas and making speeches about a company he no longer owned, had been walking around Springfield acting like a titan of industry, while the law had already moved quietly and completely, stripping everything from him. The final document appeared on screen. Emergency Asset Preservation Right, signed at 1700 hours 5 o'clock this afternoon by Judge Redmond of the Missouri State Circuit Court. And Judge Redmond's name appeared on that screen while he sat 20 feet away in the audience, his expression carefully neutral, saying absolutely nothing. Holly's screams about forgery dissolved into static noise, because everyone in that room could see Judge Redmond sitting perfectly still, not objecting, not standing up, not calling this presentation fraudulent. His silence was confirmation. His presence was validation. Every document on those screens was real. A guest near Judge Redmond's table spoke loud enough for half the room to hear. Judge Redmond signed it. She's right there. Why isn't she objecting? The judge said nothing, simply sat with her hands folded on the table, watching the screens like everyone else. Lester swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the table for support. His mouth moved, but no sound came out at first, then barely audible through his lapel microphone. I built 40 years. I watched his face and saw the exact second it landed. Not betrayal, not anger, comprehension. He'd lost everything weeks ago. Been walking around a hollow shell of an empire while believing it was still his. Tonight wasn't the destruction. Tonight was just the announcement. He finally understood, too late. Lester pushed back from the table and stood on shaking legs. His mouth opened, whether to apologize, to deny, to beg, I'll never know. Because the ballroom's main doors opened and two men in dark suits walked in, federal badges clipped to their belts, clearly visible even from across the room. They paused just inside the entrance, scanned the ballroom once with the practiced efficiency of law enforcement officers who'd done this 1,000 times. Then their eyes locked on Lester. And every person in that room understood this wasn't over. This was just beginning. I stood and walked to the stage while the federal agents waited by the door because before they took him, I needed him to hear the truth from my mouth. The crowd parted without a word. Lyle stepped aside as I reached the microphone. His hand brushed my shoulder, once steady and certain, then he melted back into the shadows. I turned to face the ballroom. 600 people stared back at me in perfect, suffocating silence. The LED screen still glowed with the August 25th court judgment, my father's signature on the 1998 codicil, the fraudulent debt report that had stolen everything. I wrapped my fingers around the microphone stand. My wedding ring caught the spotlight, 14-karat gold bought in October 2018, when I'd still believed the lies. I let the silence stretch for 3 seconds. 5. Then I spoke. Lester. My voice carried across the ballroom with a clarity that surprised even me. You're wondering how this happened? How I took everything you built in 7 years without you knowing. So I'm going to tell you. He stood frozen near table 4, one hand gripping Holly's chair for balance. His face had gone the color of old newspaper. The foundational capital for Midwest Freight Solutions was $4.2 million. I said. You obtained that capital in October 2016 through the forced liquidation of my estate, an estate I inherited separately from my father under Missouri Statute 452.330 RSMO. You used fraudulent debt claims prepared by Dwight Cummings to justify the liquidation. You transferred the proceeds into business accounts bearing only your name. I watched his lips move. No sound came out. On August 25, 2023, the Missouri State Circuit Court issued a civil decree in case number 23-CVI-8847. I continued. That decree found that the entire foundational capital was obtained through fraud and remained my separate property under Missouri law. The decree further specified that as of 5 p.m. today, September 13th, 2023, lawful control of all assets, accounts, client contracts, and physical properties derived from that capital would revert entirely to me. The screens behind me shifted. A new document appeared. The writ Judge Redmond had signed at 5 o'clock exactly 2 hours and 43 minutes ago. That includes this building, I said quietly. The office tower at 1847 Kingsbridge Boulevard, which my foundation purchased in December 2020. It includes every client you thought was yours, every investment account, every asset under management. I paused. Let the words settle like ash over the ballroom. As of tonight, you have nothing. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. 7 years ago, Lester had called me a withered shadow and stolen my inheritance while I was too broken to fight back. But I hadn't spent 7 years plotting his destruction. I'd spent 7 years becoming whole again, building a life that didn't need him, raising a daughter who would never watch her mother crumble. Tonight wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of mine. Movement near table 4 broke my focus. Lester had released Holly's chair. He took one step forward, then another. His dress shoes clicked against the ballroom floor with a sound like bones breaking. "Lorraine!" His voice cracked on my name. "Lorraine, please!" I watched him stumble forward. The crowd drew back, created a path between us like the Red Sea parting for Moses. 20 feet became 15. 15 became 10. He moved like a man walking through water, like every step cost him something he'd never get back. "Please," he said again. Then his knees buckled. He hit the floor 6 feet from the stage with a sound I felt in my chest. Lester Greer, 76 years old, founder of one of Springfield's most successful logistics companies, the man who'd controlled my life for 45 years, knelt before me on my floor. "We've been together since I was 31 years old," he whispered. Tears ran down his face and disappeared into his collar. 45 years, Lorraine. 45 years. I made mistakes. I know I made mistakes. But you can't destroy everything because of mistakes. His hands reached toward me, shaking, desperate. "I'm begging you," he said. "I'm begging you. Show mercy for what we had, for Dahlia, for everything we built together before this all went wrong." Near the back corner, Kellen shifted in Lyle's arms, watching the man on the floor with the curious detachment of a 4-year-old who didn't understand adult tears. His small hand patted Lyle's cheek, a question he was too young to voice. I looked down at my husband, and I felt nothing. Not hatred, not satisfaction, not even the savage joy I'd sometimes imagined in darker moments. Just pity, deep and clean and final. I stepped back from the microphone, moved to the edge of the stage, let him see my face clearly when I spoke. "In October 2016, you told me I'd become a withered shadow of the woman you married," I said quietly. "You said it while I was still grieving my father, still trying to understand why the estate I'd inherited had suddenly vanished. You used my depression as cover while you stole everything." I crouched down, met his eyes at the same level. "I spent 7 years becoming whole again," I said. "Not for revenge, for myself, for my daughter, for the life I deserved." I stood, smoothed my black velvet dress. "You wanted me to be a shadow," I said. "So I'm giving you what you gave me, freedom. You'll have plenty of time to enjoy it with Holly while you're both in federal prison." The 2 men in dark suits moved forward from the doorway. The taller one, mid-40s, iron-gray hair, IRS criminal investigation badge, glinting on his belt, stopped beside Lester. "Lester Greer." He said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who'd arrested hundreds. "Special Agent Marcus Tennant I knew from the briefing Lyle had given me 3 days ago. 16 years with the IRS, 93% conviction rate. You're under arrest for federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The handcuffs clicked shut around Lester's wrists. Holly's scream split the ballroom like breaking glass. Holly's scream cut off. I watched calculation flash across her face, 60 seconds to save herself by sacrificing him completely. She yanked her Hermes handbag from beside table 4 and tore it open. Documents spilled across the polished wood. She snatched a stack and raised them high. "She's right." Holly's voice cut through the ballroom. "This was all Lester. I submitted complete fraud documentation to the IRS last week. The offshore accounts are my consulting LLC. I had zero knowledge of any forgery." Lester stared up at her from the floor wrists bound in handcuffs. His face had gone gray and waxy. "Holly," his voice cracked. "What are you? We planned this together." She ignored him, turned to Special Agent Tennant with documents clutched like a shield. "Everything is documented," she said, speaking faster now. "Transaction logs, email chains, wire transfers, all bearing his signature. My attorney filed proactive disclosure under the IRS whistleblower program on September 6th. I have the submission confirmation. Her phone erupted. The vibration was loud enough to hear from the stage. Once, twice, 4 times, 6. The alerts kept coming in inbox, receiving messages faster than it could process them. Holly pulled the phone from her jacket pocket. Her Mont Blanc pen clattered to the floor and rolled away. Her face changed. I saw it happen in real-time, confidence draining like water from broken glass. She tapped the screen once, twice. Then her hand started shaking so hard the phone nearly slipped. No. Barely above a whisper. No, those accounts. They can't. Switzerland doesn't. She looked up at Agent Tennant. The accounts, she said, voice thin and brittle. The Swiss accounts, the Cayman Holdings, my Luxembourg fund. You couldn't. Those jurisdictions have banking secrecy. Agent Tennant's voice carried flat patience. Ms. Bentley, we executed freeze orders on all your accounts at 0600 this morning. U.S. accounts, offshore accounts, cryptocurrency, wallets, everything. FATCA compliance means Swiss banking secrecy died years ago. Holly's phone slipped from her fingers, hit the floor with a crack like a gunshot. Every exit she'd built, every escape route, every carefully hidden account, frozen, before she'd even tried to run. I watched her face cycle through denial, rage, and finally terror in under 10 seconds, the precise trajectory I'd lived in slow motion for 7 years. Movement near the back pulled my focus. The crowd parted again. Dwight Cummings walked through, mid-60s, thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of man who vanished into every photograph. He moved toward Holly with Agent Neil Cruz on his right and 2 federal marshals flanking him. But his wrists were free, no handcuffs, and his face held absolutely no guilt. Holly saw him. Her body went rigid. Dwight. She said his name like a curse. Tell them it was Lester. We had an agreement. We did. Dwight stopped 6 feet away, voice quiet, matter of fact. You plan to liquidate our joint retention fund and flee to Switzerland, leaving me holding the bag for every 2014, filing I signed under Lester's direction. He adjusted his glasses. Small, precise movement. So I delivered original will copies and your complete encrypted communications to the U.S. Attorney's Office 3 days ago, he continued. Cooperation agreement executed this morning. Full immunity in exchange for testimony. Holly's mouth opened. No sound came out. Her hands moved uselessly, reaching for some argument or threat that might make this stop. Agent Cruz stepped forward. Handcuffs jingled on his belt. Holly Bentley, he said, you're under arrest for wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. I have 12 attorneys, Holly whispered. Cruz continued. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided. Do you understand these rights? Holly didn't answer. Cruz took her right wrist. The first handcuff clicked shut, a sound like a door locking. He drew her left wrist back. The second click echoed through the ballroom. Near the front corner, Kellen shifted in Lyle's arms. His small voice cut through the silence with childhood clarity. Daddy, he whispered loud enough for 50 people to hear. Why is everyone wearing matching bracelets? Lyle's hand came up to cover Kellen's mouth gently. His shoulders shook once, suppressing something that might have been a laugh or a sob. The federal marshals moved forward. One hauled Lester to his feet. The other took Holly's elbow to guide her. They walked toward the exit. Lester stumbling, Holly rigid with shock. Designer heels clicking with mechanical precision. 600 people watched in silence. Not a phone camera rose. Everyone knew that documenting this would make them part of the story in ways they desperately wanted to avoid. The doors opened, closed. Footsteps faded. I stood on the stage for 3 seconds, 5. Then I stepped down and walked toward Lyle and Kellen. Kellen reached out both arms. Lyle transferred him to me with 7 years practiced coordination. Kellen's small hand found mine immediately. Fingers still chubby with childhood wrapped around my thumb. He looked up at me with absolute seriousness. "Grandma," he said. Careful gravity of a child asking something important. "Can we go home now, home?" The word hit me like a physical blow, sweet and sharp and devastating. 7 years ago, I'd lost everything. My father, my inheritance, my sense of self. The home I'd built across 4 decades had revealed itself to be a stage set, beautiful on the surface, empty behind the walls. I'd spent 7 years learning to be whole again, to be a mother Dahlia could respect, a grandmother Kellen could love without conditions, to build a life that didn't need anyone's permission but my own. Tonight, I'd taken back everything they'd stolen, the money, the business, the power. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the small hand in mine. The 4-year-old boy looking up with complete trust. The family I'd built from ashes and stubbornness and patient, strategic work. "Yes, baby," I whispered. "We can go home now." I had one again. I turned my back on the empty space where they'd stood and walked toward my grandson. Kellen's small hand remained wrapped around my thumb. His eyes tracked the federal marshals as they disappeared through the exit, wide, uncomprehending, 4 years old, and trying to make sense of handcuffs and screaming and adults who cried. "Grandma," he whispered against my shoulder. "Where did the loud man go?" "Away," I said quietly. "Very far away." Movement to my left pulled my focus. Desmond emerged from the side wings where he'd stood watching the entire evening unfold. Our eyes met across 20 feet of ballroom floor. He gave me a single soft nod, the kind that said everything words couldn't. Then he moved back into the shadows, giving me space. Mayor Wendell Ashford appeared near the stage stairs. He extended his hand as I approached his grip firm and measured in a way it hadn't been 2 hours ago when I'd been merely Lester's wife arriving at a charity gala. "Mrs. Townsend," he said. His voice carried the careful respect of a politician recalculating power dynamics in real time. "I believe you and I have quite a lot to discuss regarding the future economic development of this city." I shook his hand once, released it. "Call my office Monday morning," I said. "We'll schedule something appropriate." He stepped back, made way. I shifted Kellen higher on my hip and turned toward the exit. The crowd moved, not the panicked recoil that had accompanied the federal agents, not the stunned paralysis that had followed Lyle's documentary evidence. This was something different, something deliberate. 200 guests parted down the center of the ballroom like water flowing around stone. They created a path 6 feet wide, enough space for me to walk through without brushing against anyone, without having to navigate around chairs or tables or the wreckage of centerpieces knocked aside during the chaos. No one spoke. No one reached out to touch my arm or offer congratulations or ask what would happen next. They simply moved. And in the quality of that silence, in the way they held themselves, as I passed back straight eyes, meeting mine without flinching, I understood something fundamental had shifted. They weren't moving from fear anymore. They were moving from respect. 7 years ago, I'd walked into this ballroom on Lester's arm invisible, except as an extension of him. Tonight I walked out alone, carrying my grandson, and 600 eyes followed my path to the door. The recognition felt like sunlight after years underground. Lyle fell into step beside me as I reached the lobby. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His hand found the small of my back for 3 seconds steady, certain then gone. We'd worked too long together to need words for this. The elevator doors opened. We stepped inside. Kellen's head rested against my shoulder, his breath evening out toward sleep. The doors closed on the ballroom behind us. The corridor hadn't changed in 7 years. Same walnut paneling, same brass fixtures, same landscape paintings and gilt frames every 15 feet, but the woman standing in it had. We stopped at the second-floor landing. The The walnut banister felt smooth and cool under my palm, worn by a century of hands gripping the same wood. Below us, the lobby stretched empty and silent. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the ghost of conversations that had happened here over decades. Desmond appeared at my elbow. I hadn't heard him follow us up. "Are you all right, Mom?" His voice was soft, careful. The voice of someone who'd been holding a question for 7 years and finally had permission to ask it. I looked at him, really looked. 38 years old. My son in every way that mattered, even when his father's actions had put us on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. "For the first time in 7 years," I said quietly. "Yes." Lyle had moved a few steps down the corridor with Kellen giving us space. I could see my grandson's profile against Lyle's shoulder, eyes closed, now breathing deep and even. The sleep of a child who didn't understand what he'd witnessed but trusted the adults around him to make it right. Desmond's throat worked. He looked down at the lobby, then back at me. "I could never stand with him, Mom." The words came out rough, raw. "Regardless of whose blood is in my veins, I want you to know that. I was always there. Even when I couldn't show it. Even when being in the same room with him made me want to..." He stopped, collected himself. "I was always there." I placed my hand on his shoulder, felt the tension in his muscles, the years of holding himself carefully neutral while his father destroyed everything we'd built. "I know Desmond," I said. "That's why I never needed you to be a hero. You only ever needed to be my son." We stood in silence for 30 seconds that felt like absolution. "This corridor," I said finally, gestured at the space around us. "October 2016. I stood right here and signed the papers that gave him control of everything. I remember thinking the walnut paneling looked like coffin wood." Desmond's hand came up to cover mine where it rested on his shoulder. "It doesn't anymore," he said. "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." The circle had closed. 7 years ago, this corridor had witnessed my powerlessness, the moment I'd signed away everything, while Lester stood beside me, explaining it was all for the best, all temporary, all part of protecting the estate from creditors who didn't actually exist. Tonight it witnessed something different: restoration, reconciliation, the quiet, profound healing that happened after justice ran its course. Desmond reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. The paper looked soft, the kind of softness that came from being carried for weeks, handled carefully, folded and unfolded multiple times. "Mom," he said quietly, "there's one more thing you need to see, something I found in the archives 3 months ago." He placed it in my hands. The envelope was cream-colored. Expensive stock, no address, no postage, just a name written across the front in elegant cursive. My name. I recognized the handwriting instantly, unmistakable even after all these years. My mother's. I set the envelope aside. Unread, my mother's words could wait because I finally understood my own. The paper felt warm from being carried against Desmond's chest. I placed it on the corridor side table beneath a landscape painting of the Ozark Hills. Later. Not yet. 7 years ago, I signed those papers, and Springfield whispered I'd been obliterated. None of them knew it was simply my opening gambit. I walked to the tall window at the corridor's end. Through the glass, I could see the front entrance 2 stories below, marble steps, brass railings, the circular drive where valets had spent the evening, parking Bentleys and Teslas, and one absurdly pretentious Rolls-Royce that belonged to some tech entrepreneur who'd made his fortune in cryptocurrency. The memory came back sharp and clear. October 10th, 2016. This same corridor. Dwight Cummings standing beside me with a stack of documents that would transfer everything my father had built into Lester's sole control. Lester on my other side, one hand on my shoulder, voice smooth as silk explaining how temporary this all was, how we were simply protecting assets from aggressive creditors, how the lawyers had assured him this was the only path forward. Lies. Every word. but I'd nodded, signed, handed the pen back to Dwight with steady hands, while inside my chest something howled. That's what everyone remembered, the signing, the surrender. The moment Lorraine Townsend became another cautionary tale about grief and depression and women who let men make their decisions. What they didn't see was Dwight's face. His hands shook when he handed me the pen, not from power, from terror. I saw it in the way his fingers trembled, the way his eyes kept darting to the window like he was calculating escape routes, the way he swallowed 3 times in 10 seconds. He wasn't celebrating. He was drowning. And in that precise moment, I understood he was the crack in their wall. Holly had something on him, some leverage that made him falsify documents and commit fraud and tie his professional reputation to a scheme that could destroy him. He wasn't doing this because he wanted to. He was doing it because he was more afraid of her than he was of federal prison. That fear, that was my opening. I didn't need to beat them immediately. I just needed to wait for the fear to grow larger than the greed. 7 years. That's how long it took. 7 years of playing the broken wife, while I rebuilt myself in ways they couldn't see. 7 years of letting them think they'd won while I gathered evidence and cultivated allies and positioned every piece exactly where it needed to be. 7 years of watching Dwight's fear metastasize into the kind of panic that made men cooperate with federal prosecutors. Everyone thought I'd spent 7 years recovering. I'd spent 7 years preparing. That's the part no one writes about in revenge stories, the moment you realize the weight you're shedding isn't anger. It's something deeper, something that's been pressing into your chest for so long, you forgot what breathing freely felt like. I stood at the window now, watching federal agents lead Lester and Holly down those same marble steps. Camera flashes erupted from the street, at least 20 photographers and news crews pressed against the police barricade. Someone had tipped off the media, probably one of the 600 guests still inside the ballroom phones, already burning with texts to reporters they'd cultivated over years of social climbing. Lester stumbled on the 3rd step. A marshal caught his elbow, kept him upright. Holly walked with her spine rigid, chin up, playing dignity even with handcuffs around her wrists. Always performing. Even now. 2 black SUVs waited at the curb. Doors opened. The agents guided them inside with practiced efficiency, hands on heads, careful maneuvering to avoid hitting the door frames. The kind of choreography that came from doing this hundreds of times. The doors slammed shut. Red taillights flared in the darkness. The vehicles pulled away from the curb, turned left onto Kingsbridge Boulevard, disappeared into Springfield's Friday night traffic. Gone. I felt the weight lift. Not dramatically, not like chains breaking or prison doors opening. Just a gradual, profound lightness, the sensation of setting down something unbearably heavy after carrying it so long your muscles had forgotten they were straining. From the hallway behind me, Kellen's voice cut through the silence. And then Grandma said something really smart and everybody got quiet. His words carried the breathless excitement of a 4-year-old recounting an adventure he only half understood. Lyle's low rumble responded something I couldn't make out, but the tone was warm, amused. Desmond's laugh followed, soft and easy, the kind of laughter I hadn't heard from him in years. Kellen's laughter echoed down the corridor, 4 years old and utterly untouched by the darkness I'd just dismantled. I could have stood there all night watching the empty space where the SUVs had been, watching the photographers pack up their cameras, watching the red taillights fade into memory. Instead, I gave it 30 seconds, stood just long enough to remember, to mark the moment, to acknowledge what had ended and what was beginning. Then I turned away from the window. The corridor stretched behind me. Walnut paneling, brass fixtures, landscape paintings. Lyle stood near the elevator with Kellen on his hip. Desmond leaned against the wall beside the side table where I'd left the envelope. They were talking quietly among themselves, not waiting for me, not watching to see what I'd do, just being. existing in the space I'd fought 7 years to reclaim. I walked toward them, toward the sound of my son's laughter, toward my grandson's chatter about matching bracelets and quiet rooms, toward Lyle's steady presence and the life we'd built in the margins while everyone else watched the performance. Didn't look back. Desmond straightened as I approached. He picked up the envelope from the side table and held it out again. Cream paper, elegant cursive, my mother's handwriting still waiting after all these years. This time I took it. The paper felt cool now, substantial, real. "Let's read it together," I said. And for the first time in 7 years, my voice didn't shake when I spoke about her. My mother's letter had said, "True wealth is what remains when everything else is taken away." And 2 months later, I finally understood what she meant. Desmond and I read it together that night. Her handwriting, her voice reaching across years. She'd written it months before she died, sealed it with instructions to deliver only if I ever faced catastrophic loss. Somehow she'd known. November 2023. First formal board meeting at Midwest Freight Solutions headquarters. The Greer name scrubbed from every piece of corporate insignia, letterhead signage, the bronze lobby plaque. My father's company. My company now. 12 board members sat around the walnut conference table while I walked them through restructuring projections, operational strategies, third-quarter performance metrics. My voice stayed level, certain. "Mrs. Townsend," Gerald Mitchum said as we concluded, "mid-60s, 20 years with the company. The restructuring projections exceed every benchmark. Your parents built something extraordinary." "They did," I said, "and now we're going to build it even stronger the right way on truth." The meeting adjourned. Chairs scraped back. Conversations dissolved into hallway murmurs and elevator departures. I remained seated alone at the head of the table, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at Springfield spread below. Blue Missouri sky, downtown buildings catching afternoon light, traffic moving in orderly patterns. First morning at the boardroom table, my mind didn't drift to Lester Greer, didn't replay the gala or handcuffs or Holly's scream. I looked at that blue sky and wondered if my father could see the books were finally balanced. My mother's letter explained what took me 7 years to learn. True wealth wasn't the stolen capital or the property or the business my father built. True wealth was what remained when everything else was taken. Family truth, and the unshakable knowledge of who you are when nobody's watching. I'd lost the money. For 7 years, I'd lost everything. But I'd never lost myself. December 2023. Perfectly ordinary Sunday afternoon. I sat in the Hoffman Estate courtyard watching Kellen run across frost-dusted grass with a toy car clutched in both hands. He was bundled in a thick winter coat and bright red hat that made him look like a tiny cardinal darting between bare oak trees. "Grandma!" he shouted. "Watch how fast I can go." "I'm watching, baby," I called back. Desmond sat in a wicker chair to my left, reading financial papers with quiet focus. Lyle appeared at my elbow with the teapot, refilled my cup, without asking, added exactly the right amount of honey, settled beside me with his own mug. We'd been doing this for 7 years, building a life in the margins while everyone else watched the performance. Now the margins were the center. Now this was simply home. Kellen's legs pumped as he sprinted toward the far fence, his foot caught on a root. He went down hard knees, hitting grass, toy car, flying from his hands. He wailed for 10 seconds. I started to rise. Lyle's hand touched my arm. "Wait," he said quietly. Kellen pushed himself up, brushed off his knees, retrieved the car, and took off, sprinting again like nothing had happened. I laughed, easy and effortless, a laugh that required zero calculation. Desmond looked up from his papers and caught my eye. I offered him a gentle nod. Everything is exactly as it should be. He smiled, returned to his reading. The frost on the courtyard grass melted by noon, temporary and harmless, unlike the ice that had gripped my chest for 7 years. 7 years ago, I lost what I thought was my entire world. I had no idea the things that truly mattered could never be signed away on paper. January 2024, Monday morning. I opened the deep bottom drawer of my walnut executive desk and placed the black silk dress inside, folded, beautifully sealed in a simple protective linen box. I didn't throw it away in anger, didn't hang it like a trophy, just stored it in the far back corner directly behind newly minted Q1 financial forecasts. The dress served its purpose. Now it belonged to history, not to my present. I slid the drawer shut. The sound was final, permanent. Then I slipped into a sharp navy wool blazer the color of a perfectly normal, productive Monday and walked to the window. Springfield stretched below. Ordinary, crisp, beautiful. Cars moving through morning traffic. Office buildings filling with people starting their weeks. Coffee shops opening. Life continuing in the unremarkable way that meant everything was working exactly as it should. Some people spend their lives chasing loud victory. I found something far better, a perfectly ordinary Monday morning. If you'd told me 7 years ago that the sweetest revenge would be a boring Monday morning, I would have thought you were cruel. But standing in my office looking out at Springfield with a full schedule and balanced books and a grandson who called me grandma without hesitation, I understood what my mother had tried to tell me. The real victory wasn't the gala, wasn't the federal arrests or the courtroom judgment or watching them driven away in handcuffs. The real victory was this, a company built on truth, a family that chose each other, a life no one alive could ever take away from me again. My desk phone rang. I crossed the office and picked up the receiver. "This is Midwest Freight Solutions," I said. "Lorraine Townsend speaking." "Mrs. Townsend, how are?" A woman's voice responded, young, cheerful. "This is Jennifer from Heartland Supply. I'm calling about the scheduling conflict on the February shipment to Kansas City. Do you have a moment?" "Of course," I said. "Let me pull up the logistics file." I sat down, opened my laptop, pulled up the scheduling system while Jennifer explained the conflict, a vendor delay, a warehouse closure, nothing catastrophic. Just ordinary business requiring ordinary solutions. We worked through it in 5 minutes, rescheduled the shipment, confirmed the new timeline, said polite goodbyes. I hung up and sat back in my chair. The woman on the other end had no idea she'd just witnessed a miracle. Neither did I until I realized I was smiling. Not because I'd destroyed my enemies, not because I'd reclaimed stolen wealth or exposed fraud or watched handcuffs close around guilty wrists. I was smiling because I'd just solved a scheduling conflict on a perfectly ordinary Monday morning, and my voice hadn't trembled once when I'd said my own name. And to you listening to my story, remember this. The sweetest victory isn't watching your enemies fall, it's building a life they can never touch again. Looking back, I made mistakes. I trusted blindly for 45 years. I signed papers without reading them when I was too broken to see straight. I let depression make me vulnerable to those who should have protected me. Don't make my mistake. Trust is earned every single day, not just once at an altar. And when someone shows you who they really are through their actions, believe them. What I learned is this revenge cheating stories like mine aren't really about revenge at all. They're about reclaiming yourself. When someone betrays you, especially someone you built decades with, the temptation is to destroy them immediately. But real power comes from patience, from rebuilding so completely that their opinion becomes irrelevant. I believe God allowed me to go through those 7 dark years because I needed to learn who I was without anyone's validation. And that gave me something better than quick revenge, unshakable peace. That's what revenge cheating stories should teach us, not how to hurt back, but how to heal forward. If this resonated with you, please leave a comment below. Have you walked a similar path? What would you have done differently? Share this with someone who needs to hear that betrayal. Doesn't have to be the end of their story. And if you haven't subscribed to Her Vengeance yet, please do for more stories about rebuilding when life falls apart. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time matters, and I'm honored you spent it here with me. Final reminder, this story includes fictionalized elements for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the message.